G'day viewers. Have you ever found yourself getting into one of those arguments about whether or not migrants should speak the language of the country they've migrated to? Now, being an English speaker, this is always about telling foreigners to speak English. See a lot of big protests in America about it. It's an issue here in Australia, though we tend not to have big protests about it. People saying, speak English, damn it. Or speak English or die. I actually got that title from an old Spunk Bubbles album from the 80s, sort of punky album from the 80s called Speak Lebanese or Die. These guys all came from southwestern Sydney, and if you come from southwestern Sydney, you can sort of piece together where that's coming from. I digress slightly. The one humorous thing to me about these protests, you can get lots of pictures and videos of them online, particularly in the US, of people saying, you know, speak English, and they say English should be the official language. It's really easy to find these people saying, speak English, learn English, with just tragically stupid spelling errors on their protest posters, which kind of makes you think, well, why don't you go off and learn English first? Bit of a cheap shot. As in my personal opinion, and this gets me thrown out of the orthodox political left-wing clubs, I think migrants should learn the language of the country they move to. Not from any sort of sense of superiority, but just I think it's really stupid not to. It's hurting yourself. If you move somewhere and don't learn to speak the native language, you're cutting yourself out of so much. The idea of moving somewhere and then staying in a little enclave of people who speak the same language as you and not mixing, that to me is really stupid. And that goes for English speakers who move to other countries as well. Alright, look, if I moved somewhere to Europe or Asia where English wasn't the dominant language, I would hang out a lot with other English speakers, I'm sure. But I'd like to think I'd also make efforts to learn the language, simply in my own best interests, not in any sort of, ooh, I must bow to my new master. It would just be like, it just seems really stupid to me to not learn the language of where you are. Personal opinion. But I want to illustrate this for you with a story. This is a true story from a few years ago when I was living in Sydney. And it perfectly illustrates for me how the obnoxious people, who are quite frankly racist, their motivation for saying speak English or die is racism, pure and simple. And they're usually not real good with the language themselves, not particularly expressive. Now, this particular story takes place in a KFC in the western suburbs of Sydney, where I was living. And there was, you know, a young bleached blonde bogan princess serving behind the counter. And just in front of the line, in front of me, was a Chinese granny and her granddaughter. And I'd say the granny did not speak a lot of English, and it was affecting her ability to order. And the little girl was also wrapping her around her finger, saying, basically her conversation was, yeah, Mum totally said this is what I should have for dinner, so order that one and hand over some money. And then Granny's trying to place the order with the bogan behind the counter, and her English is not very good, and you could tell the bogan is disgusted by this because there's a lot of as Granny's trying to make an order in her very broken English, and she gets an order, you know, a 3-piece this, a bucket of that, whatever, and she places the order, and then the bogan, to show, I don't know, her superiority, goes, and I swear, I am not exaggerating her accent. She said like this, with no preamble, with no explanation, this is what she says to Granny. And Granny just goes, quite justifiably, facial expression of, what the fuck did that guttural noise mean? And Granny clearly doesn't understand. Bogan's clearly upset that Granny doesn't understand, and instead of explaining at all, just repeats in the same hideous nasal tone, and Granny's still going, the fuck is going on here? And Bogan's going, and she's pointing at like the cup and the chips, going, and I just wanted to reach across the counter and strangle her and say, for fuck's sake, just explain what you're saying. So for an extra $1, you can get a large drink and a large chips. We call that upsizing. Do you want to upsize it? I speak English, and it was a little while before I understood what you were trying to get at with So I would just like to say, yeah, I honestly think if you migrate to a country, you should learn the language. But really, if you were born there, learn to fucking speak